but my research on Tar Creek started probably almost 20 years ago. And so there was a lot of historical information about the Tar Creek area, the mining operations that went back almost 100 years, and then lots of emphasis on Superfund designation in 1983 and the subsequent recommendations to the people that they relocate. But then their resistance to it was what got my attention. And so several different projects led to the final project for my dissertation that focused on the families, though.
In the later 1800s, the mining shifted slightly west, and so began in Kansas, southeastern Kansas. There was a discovery, though, in the 1910s. It was 1914, 1915. Discovery of lead and zinc ore that was just north, I believe, of Miami, about 4 miles away. And this was really rich ore. So the ore they were pulling out of southwestern Missouri is, 5–6% mineral in the ore. So it's a rich content, but it's not anywhere as rich as it was in this new strike. So in the new strike, the ore was showing between 10 and 30% mineral in content. And so you can't leave this alone. This is a big attraction, and it attracted all kinds of attention. Workers who were looking to become mine owners, mine operators, the mining companies that had already been operating in Missouri, they all kind of flocked into the area and began digging around and finding stuff. A few years down the road, the flavor of the camps changed. And so you can see this happen in California with the 49ers. The early miners are really rough, and they spend a lot, and they don't save very much, and they're single. And then a few years down the road, they begin to migrate in family groups, and the population kind of settles down. That happened in the mining area in Oklahoma. So Picher ended up being one of those centers where people began to live. The mines were there, and the population began to settle down and become a little bit more stable.
They were still in place in their homes as of 2011. My research concluded in 2011. What has happened since then, I'm not certain about, but I have heard that some families have relocated since then, who were holdouts, who told me that they would never leave. In many cases, I don't think they had much choice, because they were left without public utilities that had previously been in place, and so they had to take measures to address those kinds of inconvenience. But they were willing to do it, and prided themselves on being very resourceful, which I think was actually a defense mechanism, probably, but in an attempt to justify or to rationalize their actions, they would refer to themselves as being very creative and very resourceful, and they certainly didn't need the government.
This is really deep ore. If you look at the mines that grew up around southwestern Missouri, the deepest of them were maybe 50 feet deep. The mines in Oklahoma were up to 450 feet deep, but it's dark, and it's cold, and it's wet. So there were pumps that had to operate all the time, and this ore is in hard rock, and so you can't just chip away at the ore and pull chunks out. You have to have explosions. You have to drill. You have to have the kind of equipment and explosives that will create a lot of dust. And this is really hard rock. The dust doesn't just go away. So you're breathing in this dust-filled air, and you're getting little grains of the equivalent of sand into your lungs, silica dust. And this gets into your lungs and it doesn't come back out. So coal miners dealt with a very similar kind of situation. They breathed in coal dust and they would develop what's known as black lung disease. So a normal person will be able to cough things out or cough things up, cough the mucus out of their lungs. And these miners who had silica filling their lungs, they couldn't do that. These miners would die of pneumonia. They would die of the equivalent of emphysema, and a lot of them got tuberculosis. While national rates of tuberculosis were falling, the rates of tuberculosis in the Picher area were skyrocketing. Silicosis is not something that is communicable. You get it by breathing the dust, not by living next to somebody who has breathed the dust. But tuberculosis is something that you can communicate. And so the miners were more susceptible to tuberculosis, which made the mining families more susceptible.
Well, first of all, I didn't go too deeply into the medical aspect of the issue. Mine was much more focused on the social aspects of it. And you mentioned the chat piles, which became a very, very significant symbolic issue for my study. So from a sociological perspective, the chat piles represented a sense of security, and actually my conclusion was that the chat piles serve as monuments. The chat piles are monuments to a lifestyle. And so the people, many of the, not all, but many of the people that I interviewed, they feel so connected to the chat piles. And so they would say things like, I played on the chat piles, my children played on the chat piles, we're not sick, even though the Harvard study found elevated levels of lead in the blood of the people who participated in the study.
So you pull the rock out of the ground and you crush it into tiny pieces and you process it and you pull the ore out. What's left behind is essentially gravel, but they called it chat. And they would process the ore and leave the chat behind, and they would make mountains of chat. And huge, huge hills that if you flew an airplane over the area, these would look like mountains when you're looking down at them. Huge piles of gravel. An outsider who would look at the piles of chat would think, this is really dirty. Why would people live near this? Why would people put up with this? People living in Picher saw the piles of chat totally differently. So the miners would look at their own piles of chat and they would say, look how much our mine is producing. We built that pile of chat. That's our pile. And they would name the piles of chat and they would measure them, who's got the bigger pile. And they kind of took ownership of their own piles of chat. The little kids would play on the piles during the winter when there would be frost on the ground. The frost would cover the chat and it would just sparkle in the sunlight. And the miners looked at that, and the families of the miners looked at that and they said, this is beautiful. It's a monument to their work. Outsiders didn't see it that way. On windy days, there would be dust that would come off of the chat piles. An outsider would look at that and they would calculate that that dust was probably causing silicosis. But you can't get silicosis from that level of dust contamination in the air. You really have to be in an enclosed space. And when they would get there, they would see the housing and they'd see the outhouses and they'd see the people who don't seem to be saving money, clearly aren't living a middle-class existence, and they would pass judgment. why would you live here? Why would you put up with this? Why would you live next to this garbage dump of chat? The people who were living in Picher understood this. They knew that they were being judged. And so what developed was a resistance to the help that they were being offered. And of course, the help that's being offered is help that's kind of underhanded or not offered freely. When the mines stopped operating the pumps, the mines filled up, and so the water would sit right there next to the ore, and after a while, that water is going to leach the lead out of the ground, and so the groundwater is going to be contaminated with lead. The problem was the groundwater, and the problem was the smelters. And the problem probably also came from the lead paint everybody was using in the United States at the time.
Most of the people I interviewed showed contempt for the EPA. So they did not indicate that they valued any information that came from the EPA. They saw the EPA as the enemy. They viewed them as foreigners, they're outsiders. They thought that they just wanted to take advantage of them maybe, and then ultimately they were threatening their sense of security. And so I think it was easier for them to frame the outsiders as in a negative way, as the enemy, than to listen to the results of the research that they did that I would think most people would just find overwhelming. That research was so compelling, at least to me.
The area was hit by the Great Depression, so the mines slowed down. Eventually it petered out. So in the 1950s, by the middle of the 1950s, the jobs had gone. So as the population dwindled, the EPA became interested in what's going on in the area, and it was designated a Superfund site in the 1980s. They eventually decided that you just can't fix it. You got to buy the town out, close it down. And that's what they ended up doing. So they bought the town out, they closed it down, and everybody who was living there had to move. They had to leave their homes.
I know that there was a thriving community in that location not that long ago. It is such a tragedy. What a sad conclusion, I guess, to what was once such a thriving community.
People are going to stay somewhere as long as it's convenient for them to stay. And convenience depends on your perspective. They have a love of home. They have a love of that memory of what used to be there. And does that love of what used to be there overcome their desire for comfortable living? In the case of Picher, the government made that decision for them.